Well, Shaka, we're in the final week of the decade, and it's been a decade of two halves for Manchester United.
Yeah.
The Fergie years and the after Fergie leaves years.
Yeah,
Now,
it's the best way to describe it.
we're looking for the top three players, your top three players between 2010 and now. They'd all have a shout for being in the discussion. I was actually watching a thing last night with Rooney and Gary Neville, and Gary was going through Rooney's goals in various seasons, and let's just say, I don't know what you're going to go. I'll be surprised if Rooney's not in your top three. Let's have some drama and start at three.
All right, let me just give myself a little bit of a precursor here. A number of Manchester United greats who you believe would feature in all-time great Manchester United teams. Their careers maybe straddled the start of this decade. For instance, Paul Scholes. Now, I'm no Manchester United fan, so I'm not the one to be picking an all-time great Manchester United team. But Paul Scholes, for me, one of the best midfielders that I've seen wear the red of Manchester United. Though he can't get into this team just because of where the bulk of his career, the meaningful years of his career, fell outside of this decade. That being said, in at number three, I'm going to go with Michael Carrick.
Really?
Yes. I still don't think that the game has seen, or this decade has seen, a pass of the ball like Michael Carrick.
Was he slightly ahead of his time?
Very much so. Underappreciated.
Yep.
But at the perfect club in Manchester United for his talents. I don't think anybody else, certainly at the time, could have accommodated Michael Carrick in the way that United did. I don't think people understood or recognized the impact of his retirement from Manchester United did. They had nobody who could pass the ball, and they've struggled almost ever since.
I'd be intrigued to know how many Man United fans would have Carrick in the top three. Very much appreciated. But is that an ex-pro appreciating a fellow pro's hard work?
But, absolutely. But again, and it's because of, we are talking about this decade.
Yeah.
And when you start mentioning the great United players like Giggs, like Scholes who are mentioned, the partnership of Vidic and Ferdinand, you straddle the start of the decade, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to choose. Again, but Michael Carrick, for me, I think deserving to be involved, given the parameters of this discussion at the very least. Number two might surprise you a little bit.
Number three surprised me.
And the reason I have this player in at number two is, again, we're talking about the decade. And that career straddling the start of this decade. And my number one's all his meaningful work happening in this decade. My number two, again, another of Manchester United's all-time greats.
Wow.
But, as I mentioned, given either side of the decade, I just felt what we've seen from Wayne Rooney, this decade maybe doesn't eclipse who I have in as number one, though if we're talking about the full package, he would get in ahead of my number one.
If that was Man United top three since 2000, that would be different.
Oh, yeah, it would be a totally different list.
This is since 2010.
Yes. What? David De Gea, despite his wobbles of recent years, and it's easy to forget, we all know how short-term our footballing memory is, but wasn't it something like 6 times Player of the Year for Manchester United over the course of this decade? That just tells its own story. And maybe it's more speaking to Manchester United's own struggles over the course of this decade as to why you have a goalkeeper in. But
I mentioned watching that Rooney and Neville thing last night, and they spoke about David De Gea. And they spoke about when he first arrived at the club. And this is something you and I spoke about as well. Fergie wanted to give him time. The players weren't convinced. Rooney said that. Neville said that. They're like, this big kid who's, well, we're not sure about him. But when you and I, when we were doing games together, when he signed for United, you said he's got the attributes, but he's raw. His footwork isn't good enough.
His footwork was awful, and we spoke about that to no end. What didn't help David De Gea as well, and it was easy to forget that he was 19.
Yeah, exactly.
That you, especially in English football, especially at the time, you hang a cross up, and you just make it a physical battle between a grown man and a 19-year-old. And oftentimes he would lose, and he would lose his confidence. And as a result, he would come and be punching things or trying to punch things that he could catch easily. And just that little lack of experience, and again, physicality, maybe cost him in those early years. Now, I also understand the apprehension about when he first come. And Sir Alex Ferguson wanted to give him time.
Yep.
But when you're at a club like Manchester United, you don't often have time. You have to hit the ground running. As an example of teenagers hitting the ground running, none better than Wayne Rooney.
Exactly.
Arrives from Everton, is scoring hat-tricks in the Champions League with his deep. I mean, that's maybe an unfair comparison, but you understand why some players at Manchester United weren't all that sure.
Finally, you've given us your top 3 of the decade. As we move into the next decade, we're starting to see more mistakes creep into David De Gea. Do you think Gunnar Solskjaer and do you think Manchester United will now be looking about getting in a successor sooner rather than later, or do you still believe in him?
They have to stick with him. He just signed a new deal on an awful lot of money. I'm not sure that David De Gea gets that money anywhere else. I don't think anybody else offers that kind of money, given what we've seen of him over the last 18 months to 2 years. So right now, Solskjaer has to make all the right noises around David De Gea and his future. But do I think we'll see David De Gea regain the form that seen him top this list? I'm not so sure.
Carrick at 3, Rooney at 2, De Gea at 1. Shaka's top 3 of the decade at Old Trafford.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.